The afternoon sun hung low as Karen Brooks stepped out of the store carrying a bag of groceries she had paid for in full, the receipt still tucked neatly inside beside her wallet. 4 patrol officers suddenly stepped into her path and blocked the exit to the parking lot. A young store employee pointed a trembling finger in her direction and shouted the words that would change everything in an instant. "That's her," he said. "That's the woman who stole from us." Karen stood still, calm on the outside though her heart had begun to race, and explained that the receipt was right there in the bag if anyone cared to look. Not one officer reached for it, not one officer asked to see it. Instead, with dozens of phones already raised and recording from every angle of the lot, they pulled her arms behind her back and locked the handcuffs around her wrists in front of a crowd that had gathered within seconds. It was only when one young officer happened to glance down at the faint tattoo on the inside of her wrist, a small insignia belonging to an elite tactical unit, that his stomach dropped and his hands went cold. The woman they had just placed under arrest, the woman being led toward a patrol car in front of a screaming crowd, was their own police captain, currently off duty and simply trying to enjoy a quiet afternoon like anyone else. Amara Ellison had served the city's police department for many years with a sense of duty that ran deeper than any badge could measure. She had climbed through the ranks not through connections or luck, but through relentless work, fair judgment, and a reputation among her colleagues for treating every single person, victim or suspect, rich or poor, with the same measured respect. Officers who had come up under her leadership often said the same thing about her, that Captain Ellison never raised her voice unless the situation demanded it, and that she never assumed the worst about anyone before the facts were in. That was precisely why so many people would later find what happened to her almost impossible to believe. On this particular day, a rare day off after a stretch of demanding shifts, Amara had no intention of being recognized by anyone. She left her badge locked in a drawer at home, left her department vehicle parked in the garage, and dressed in a simple pair of faded blue jeans and a plain gray hoodie, the kind of outfit that made her look like any other tired woman running errands on a Saturday. She drove her own car, an older sedan with a dent in the back bumper, to a large retail store on the edge of town, the kind of place with wide aisles and long lines and employees who rotated through so quickly that almost nobody recognized regular customers, let alone an off-duty police captain. Nobody there had any reason to know who she was, and that was exactly the point. For many years, Amara had joked with her closest colleagues that the uniform, however proud she was to wear it, also carried a strange kind of loneliness with it. The way people's faces shifted the moment they recognized her rank, the way conversations grew careful and guarded whenever a badge entered the room. She missed more than she ever admitted out loud, the simple experience of being just another face in a crowded store, unnoticed and unremarkable, free to move through the world without anyone adjusting their behavior around her presence. Amara wanted for just one afternoon to be an ordinary woman doing ordinary things, without radios crackling in her ear or reports waiting on her desk. Inside the store, she moved unhurried through the aisles, humming quietly to herself as she compared prices on cereal boxes and checked expiration dates on a carton of milk. When an elderly man struggled to reach a bag of rice on a top shelf, she stepped over without being asked and lifted it down for him with an easy smile, telling him to take care crossing the parking lot since the pavement was still wet from the morning rain. At the register, she chatted warmly with the young cashier, complimenting the girl's earrings and asking how her classes were going. The kind of small, pleasant exchange that happens 1,000 times a day and is forgotten within minutes by everyone involved, except perhaps by the person who received the kindness. What Amar did not see, because her back was turned and her attention was on the friendly cashier, was the store's overhead camera slowly panning across the sales floor toward another woman entirely. A stranger dressed in strikingly similar clothing, a blue hooded sweatshirt and dark jeans, carrying a tote bag the same shade of tan as Amara's own. This other woman moved differently, her eyes darting toward the corners of the ceiling where the security domes were mounted, her shoulders tense in the particular way of someone who has done this before and knows exactly which blind spots to use. With practiced, almost lazy fingers, she slipped 2 tubes of expensive facial cream and a small bottle of perfume into the depths of her tote bag, tucking them beneath a folded sweater so the shape would not show. Amara finished paying, thanked the cashier one more time, and walked toward the automatic doors with her bag swinging gently at her side, completely unaware that outside in the parking lot, Her afternoon was about to be hijacked by a case of mistaken identity that no one involved would soon forget. The real thief left through a side exit only moments after Amara walked out the front, moving quickly but not quite fast enough to avoid the loss prevention officer stationed near the entrance. A heavy-set man named Gary Reed, who had been half watching his phone rather than the monitors, caught only a fleeting glimpse from a distance. A woman in a blue hoodie moving briskly toward the parking lot. In the 2 or 3 seconds he had to register any details, he convinced himself he was looking at the same woman who had just walked past the registers minutes earlier. It was a mistake born of carelessness rather than malice, but a mistake it certainly was, and Gary radioed it in without a second thought, describing only what he thought he had seen. "Black female, blue hoodie, heading toward the north side of the lot," he said into his radio, the words clipped and urgent. The kind of vague description that could apply to a dozen different women shopping that same afternoon. Within moments, 3 patrol cars that happened to be nearby responded to the call, lights flashing as they rolled into the parking lot with the kind of adrenaline that comes from believing a crime is actively unfolding. Amara, walking calmly toward her own car with her bag of groceries, had no idea any of this was happening until a young officer stepped directly into her path and raised a hand toward her chest. "What's going on?" Amara asked, her voice even and measured, the tone of someone accustomed to diffusing tension rather than escalating it. None of the 4 officers answered her directly, instead exchanging glances among themselves as if silently deciding who would take the lead. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Officer Brody Kane, finally spoke, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone who had already made up his mind about the situation. "Set the bag down on the ground," he told her. Amara, still calm, still measured, asked the only reasonable question available to her in that moment. "Do you have a warrant or reason to search my bag?" she asked quietly, not raising her voice, not stepping backward, simply asking the kind of question any citizen has every right to ask. The question seemed to irritate rather than inform, and Kane's jaw tightened visibly, as though her composure itself was somehow more suspicious than helpful, as though a guilty woman would surely be panicking by now rather than standing there so evenly. It was a strange and troubling truth that would only become clear much later, that Amara's calm confidence, the very quality that had made her such an effective leader for many years, was being read by these officers as arrogance rather than innocence, and that misreading was about to carry devastating consequences. Amara reached slowly and deliberately into her bag, making sure her movements were visible and unhurried, and pulled out the printed receipt that had been resting right on top of her purchases the entire time. She held it out toward Officer Kane, her hand steady, and told him plainly that every item in the bag had been paid for only minutes earlier, and that the transaction number and timestamp were right there in black and white for anyone willing to look. Kane barely glanced at the paper before waving it away with something close to contempt in his voice. "Anybody can print one of these at home," he said, a claim so easily disproven and yet stated with such total confidence that several bystanders nearby exchanged uneasy looks. Amara, refusing to let frustration creep into her tone, asked once more, this time more specifically, whether anyone intended to pull the store's security footage before taking this any further. Nobody moved to do so. A young store employee standing near the entrance, a teenage girl who had watched the entire encounter unfold, took a hesitant step forward and said quietly that she wasn't entirely sure this was even the same woman who had left the store, but her voice was thin and uncertain against the growing chaos. Before the girl could finish her sentence, the store manager, a stocky man named Rick Harlan, who had rushed outside upon hearing the commotion, cut her off sharply and told her to let the police handle it, insisting this wasn't something for employees to weigh in on. By now, a crowd had begun gathering along the edge of the parking lot, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices, and dozens of phones rose into the air to capture what was unfolding. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, some voices calling out that this looked like blatant racial profiling unfolding in broad daylight for anyone with eyes to see, while other voices, quieter but no less present, argued that if the woman was truly innocent, she would simply let the officers verify it and clear the matter up. The tension in the parking lot thickened with every passing second. 4 armed officers surrounded a single unarmed woman who had done nothing but ask reasonable questions while a crowd of strangers debated her guilt or innocence in real time without a single verified fact between them. Somewhere in that swelling crowd, a woman whispered to her friend that she recognized something familiar in the arrested woman's face but couldn't place where from, a small detail that would matter enormously in the hours to come. The situation had crossed the point where calm words alone could resolve it, and everyone standing in that parking lot could feel, with a kind of collective dread that something was about to happen that could not be easily undone. A man near the front of the crowd, an older gentleman named Harold Lang, who had lived in the neighborhood for many years, stepped forward and asked in a voice loud enough for the officers to hear whether anyone intended to simply walk back inside and pull the footage before things went any further. His question was reasonable, practical, the kind of solution that could have ended the entire standoff within minutes. Yet it too was waved away, this time by Officer Kane, who insisted that procedure required them to secure the suspect first and sort out details later. Harold shook his head slowly, muttering to the woman beside him that he had seen this exact pattern play out before, and that it rarely ended the way people hoped it would. Nearby, a mother pulled her young son gently away from the front of the crowd, shielding his view of the unfolding scene. Though the boy kept craning his neck to watch anyway, his eyes wide with the particular curiosity children carry before the world teaches them to look away. Amara did not resist, did not raise her hands, did not so much as flinch when Officer Kane finally stepped behind her and reached for the handcuffs hanging from his belt. What she refused to do, however, was sign the incident acknowledgement form that another officer thrust toward her, a document that would have amounted to an admission of guilt before any actual investigation had taken place. "I will cooperate fully," she told them evenly, "but I will not sign something that isn't true." And there was a quiet steel in her voice that made even the officers pause for half a second before continuing. Kane, his patience worn thin by what he perceived as defiance rather than principle, moved forward and closed the cuffs around her wrists with more force than the moment required. The metal clicked shut with a sound that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent parking lot. Amara's phone slipped from her jacket pocket during the struggle and clattered onto the pavement, its screen cracking against the asphalt, and a ripple of gasps and shouted objections rose from the crowd of bystanders who had watched every second unfold. Several people surged forward instinctively, phones still recording, voices rising in protest until other officers moved to hold the crowd back at a distance. Amara said nothing further as she was guided toward the open door of the patrol car, offering no protest, no plea, no attempt to explain who she truly was. Instead, she was silent, deliberately silent, watching each of the four officers with the sharp, assessing eyes of someone cataloging every mistake being made in real time. As the door shut and the car pulled away from the curb, she sat in the back seat with her hands cuffed behind her, her posture straight, her breathing controlled, giving no outward sign of the storm building quietly inside her. It would have taken only a single sentence for her to end this entire ordeal within seconds, one sentence identifying her rank and her badge number, yet she chose to say nothing at all. Watching from outside, anyone might have wondered why a woman with the power to instantly clear her own name would choose instead to remain silent through such an injustice, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it would for any ordinary citizen without connections or rank to shield them. The answer to that question would not become clear until much later, but it was rooted in something Amara had believed for the entirety of her career: the conviction that a badge should never be a shortcut around justice, but rather a lens through which justice could finally be seen clearly by everyone who wore one. It was a young officer named Reed Sullivan, still relatively new to the job and still young enough to notice details his more seasoned colleagues had stopped paying attention to, who first began to sense that something about this arrest did not add up. Watching Amara through the rearview mirror as he drove, Reed noticed the way she sat, spine straight, shoulders squared, her eyes methodically tracking every landmark and street sign they passed, as though she were memorizing the route out of habit rather than fear. It was not the posture of a frightened suspect, but the posture of someone trained, someone who had spent years learning to observe a scene rather than simply endure it. When Reed made a passing comment about traffic patterns near the station, Amara responded with a term specific to internal department protocol, a phrase most ordinary citizens would never have reason to know, let alone use so naturally and precisely. Reed glanced at his partner beside him, a slight furrow forming between his brows, and asked almost jokingly whether she used to work in private security or something similar. Amara only offered a small, unreadable smile in response, saying nothing more, leaving the question hanging unanswered in the quiet of the car. At a red light, another officer riding in the second vehicle happened to catch sight of a faint scar along Amara's forearm, visible where her sleeve had ridden up slightly during the struggle at the store, a scar with the particular jagged shape that comes from specialized tactical training rather than an ordinary household accident. He mentioned it under his breath to his partner, who dismissed it at first, assuming it was nothing more than coincidence. But then came the tattoo, small and faded with age, positioned exactly where officers within the department's former Special Weapons and Tactics Unit traditionally marked themselves, a symbol very few civilians would ever recognize and even fewer would dare to fake. Reed, still watching Amara in the mirror, felt a cold, uneasy suspicion begin to form in the pit of his stomach, though he could not yet name exactly what it was he feared. He said nothing to Kane, unsure whether raising the concern now would help or simply be dismissed the same way Amara's own receipt had been dismissed less than 20 minutes earlier. By the time they pulled into the station's parking garage, a quiet unease had settled among the officers, an unspoken sense that something about this arrest was far more complicated than a simple shoplifting call. Reed found himself replaying the entire encounter in his mind as he parked the vehicle, turning over every small detail that had felt slightly wrong from the very beginning. The way Amara had immediately known to ask about a warrant. The way she had held her hands perfectly still during the handcuffing, neither resisting nor flinching, as though her body understood something her circumstances did not yet allow her to say aloud. The way she had scanned the parking lot before getting into the car, not with fear, but with the practiced sweeping attention of someone assessing exits and threats out of pure habit. None of it, taken individually, proved anything at all. Yet together, the details formed a pattern that nagged at him with growing insistence, a pattern he could not quite name but could not ignore either. And it was that very unease that would soon prove to be entirely justified. Inside the station, Amara remained composed as she was walked through booking, her expression calm, almost patient, as though she had witnessed this exact process unfold from the other side of the desk more times than she could count, which, of course, she had. Rather than pleading her case loudly or demanding special treatment, she simply repeated the same quiet request she had made back in the parking lot. "Please pull the store security footage before this goes any further," she said, her tone even and unwavering, the request of someone who trusted the process, even while the process was failing her. The officer working the front desk that evening, a heavy-set veteran named Sergeant Harlan Shaw, pulled up her booking information out of routine procedure, typing her full name into the department's internal database without much thought. When the name Amara Ellison appeared on the screen, Harlan assumed at first it was simply a coincidence, a common enough name shared by countless people across the city. He clicked further into the record out of habit more than suspicion, entering her employee identification number as a final formality before printing the booking sheet. What appeared on the screen next made Harlan's breath catch somewhere in his throat. In bold letters beneath her photograph, taken years earlier during her promotion ceremony, were two words that turned the entire room to ice: "Police Captain." Harlan stared at the screen for a long moment, certain he had misread it, certain there had to be some clerical error, some duplicate file, some explanation that made sense of what he was looking at. But the badge number matched, the date of hire matched, the department division matched, down to the exact precinct where he himself had worked for many years. Somewhere behind him, an officer carrying 2 paper cups of coffee froze mid-step, and one cup slipped from his hand entirely, hitting the tile floor and splashing dark liquid across his boots, though he barely seemed to notice, his eyes fixed instead on the screen over Harlan's shoulder. Nobody in that booking room said a single word for what felt like an unbearably long stretch of silence, the kind of silence that settles over a room the instant everyone realizes all at once that something has gone catastrophically wrong. Word spread through the station faster than anyone could have anticipated, moving from one hushed conversation to the next until it reached the desk of the shift commander, a tall, graying lieutenant named Victor Lang, who had worked alongside Amara for many years. Victor came down the stairs 2 at a time, his expression somewhere between disbelief and dread. And when he rounded the corner into the booking area and saw Amara sitting there, still handcuffed, still calm, the color drained visibly from his face. "Captain Ellison," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though saying her name too loudly might somehow make the situation worse than it already was. Every officer within earshot straightened instinctively, the kind of automatic response drilled into them through years of respecting rank, though the gesture felt almost painfully hollow, given the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. Officer Kane, the man who had placed the handcuffs on her in the first place, stood frozen near the wall, his face a pale, sickly shade, unable to meet Amara's eyes even for a second. Amara did not raise her voice, did not gloat, did not allow even a flicker of satisfaction to cross her face despite everything that had just been revealed. She simply looked at Victor and asked the same question she had been asking from the very beginning, patient and unwavering even now. "Has anyone reviewed the store's security footage yet?" she asked again. And the quiet dignity in her voice made the silence in the room feel even heavier than before. Victor immediately ordered someone to pull the footage, and within minutes, a technician had the store's recordings loaded onto a monitor for the entire room to see. The footage showed, with undeniable clarity, another woman entirely dressed similarly but distinctly different upon close inspection, slipping merchandise into her bag in an aisle Amara had never even walked through that day. Beside that footage played a second angle, this one from near the entrance, showing Amara calmly checking out at the register, handing cash to the cashier, and placing her receipt directly on top of her bag, exactly where she had said it would be all along. The truth, once finally examined, took only a matter of minutes to establish beyond any doubt. A truth that could have spared Amara the entire ordeal if only someone had bothered to look sooner. What happened next revealed more about Amara Ellison than perhaps anything that had come before it. Once the handcuffs were removed and a flustered round of apologies began, several officers assumed the matter would simply end there, that Amara would accept their contrition, collect her belongings, and quietly go home to put the entire humiliating afternoon behind her. Amara did nothing of the sort. Instead, she requested a formal meeting with the department's Internal Affairs Division, insisting that a full and transparent investigation be opened into exactly how this arrest had unfolded from start to finish. When Victor gently suggested that given her rank, this could perhaps be handled quietly and informally, Amara looked at him with an expression that left no room for negotiation. "If this had happened to any other citizen today, would you be offering to handle it quietly?" she asked him directly, and Victor had no honest answer to give her. Amara explained calmly but firmly that her position as captain was never meant to shield her from scrutiny, but rather to hold her to an even higher standard than everyone else, and that letting this slide without consequence would betray every principle she had spent many years trying to build within the department. In the days immediately following her release, Amara returned to work exactly as scheduled, refusing every suggestion from concerned colleagues that she take additional time off to recover from the ordeal. Several officers who greeted her that first morning back struggled to meet her eyes, unsure whether to apologize, whether to pretend nothing had happened, or whether to simply wait for her to set the tone herself. Amara chose the third option, walking into the building with the same steady composure she always carried, greeting the front desk staff by name, asking after a sergeant's newborn daughter, behaving in every visible way as though the previous weekend had been nothing more than an unpleasant footnote, rather than the defining moment it had already become for everyone around her. It was this refusal to perform either victimhood or anger that unsettled some of her colleagues far more than outrage ever could have, because it forced them to sit with their own discomfort rather than deflecting it onto her instead. The internal investigation that followed was thorough, methodical, and at Amara's specific insistence made available to the public rather than buried within internal files. Investigators reviewed every piece of available evidence: the store's security footage from multiple angles, the officer's body camera recordings, the original radio dispatch, and written statements taken from each officer, from store employees, and from several bystanders who had witnessed the arrest firsthand. What emerged from that review was a troubling picture of cascading failures, each one small on its own, but devastating when stacked together. The original radio call had been based on nothing more than a fleeting, uncertain glance from a loss prevention officer who admitted under questioning that he had never gotten a clear look at the suspect's face. Officer Kane had made no attempt to examine the receipt Amara offered him despite her providing it within moments of the encounter. No officer on the scene had requested the store's security footage before proceeding with the arrest, even though the request would have taken only a matter of minutes. And the decision to apply handcuffs had been made not because Amara posed any physical threat or attempted to flee, but simply because she had declined to sign a document she believed correctly to be false. Investigators also uncovered a detail that troubled Amara more than almost anything else in the entire ordeal. The young store employee who had voiced her uncertainty in the parking lot, the one who said she wasn't entirely sure this was the same woman, had been immediately silenced by her own manager rather than encouraged to speak further. That single suppressed voice, had it been allowed to continue, might have unraveled the entire mistaken arrest within the very first minute. Amara made a point of personally thanking that young employee later, telling her that the courage to speak up, even quietly, even against pressure from a supervisor, mattered more than most people ever realized. It was, Amara said, exactly the kind of instinct the world needed more of, not less. The investigation ultimately concluded that 4 separate and preventable breakdowns in procedure had occurred that afternoon, any one of which, if corrected, could have stopped the wrongful arrest before it ever began. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of that single afternoon rippled outward through the department and the store alike, transforming what might have remained a quietly buried incident into a catalyst for genuine reform. Officer Brody Kane was placed on administrative suspension while the investigation concluded and was later required to complete extensive retraining focused on de-escalation and evidence verification before he would be permitted to return to active duty. The store's general manager, Rick Harlan, issued a public apology standing outside the very entrance where the arrest had taken place, acknowledging that his staff had failed to follow basic verification procedures and pledging that every loss prevention employee would undergo new, more rigorous training before returning to the sales floor. Gary Reed, the loss prevention officer whose hurried glance had set the entire chain of events into motion, was reassigned to a different role within the company, one that did not involve identifying or reporting suspected shoplifters without corroborating evidence. Beyond these individual consequences, the police department itself undertook a broader review of its arrest procedures, ultimately adopting new department-wide policy requiring officers to review available surveillance footage whenever it existed before making any arrest connected to a retail theft complaint. The department also introduced a mandatory waiting period before handcuffs could be applied in non-violent retail theft situations, requiring officers to first attempt basic verification, a receipt check, a witness statement, a look at available camera footage, unless the suspect posed an immediate physical threat or attempted to flee the scene. Training sessions were restructured to include real case studies, Amara's own arrest chief among them, presented not as an isolated failure, but as a teaching tool meant to illustrate exactly how quickly good intentions could curdle into injustice when procedure was treated as optional rather than essential. A new position was created within the department, an officer whose sole responsibility was reviewing bias-related complaints and near-miss incidents, cases where a wrongful arrest had been narrowly avoided only through luck rather than proper procedure. Lieutenant Victor Lang, still shaken by how close his own department had come to permanently damaging one of its most respected captains, personally championed many of these reforms, appearing before the city council to request additional funding for the retraining programs Amara had insisted upon from the very beginning. Amara, true to her word, declined every offer of a quiet, private apology extended to her behind closed doors. When Victor suggested a small internal ceremony to formally acknowledge the department's failure and offer her a personal apology away from public view, Amara shook her head and told him that would defeat the entire purpose. If the mistake happened in public, in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras, then the accountability needed to happen in public as well, she said. Otherwise, nothing about the process would feel honest to the people who had watched it unfold. Video captured that day by bystanders had already begun circulating widely by the time the investigation concluded. And rather than resist or suppress it, Amara chose to speak publicly about what had happened, using her own experience as a lens through which the broader community could examine questions of bias, procedure, and the fragile trust between citizens and the officers meant to protect them. Some people who saw the footage focused on the irony of a police captain being wrongfully arrested by her own department, while others saw something more important in it, a rare and uncomfortable mirror held up to a system that too often moved forward on assumption rather than verification. A local news anchor named Elena Vargas picked up the story within days, tracking down several of the bystanders who had filmed the original arrest and compiling their footage alongside the department's own eventual statement. Elena's report aired during the evening broadcast, opening not with commentary, but with the raw, unedited video of Amara standing calmly in that parking lot, asking again and again for someone to simply check the receipt in her hand. Viewers across the city watched the sequence unfold in real time. The four officers, the crowd, the handcuffs, and finally the stunned silence back at the station when the truth was revealed. And the reaction that followed was immediate and widespread. Local council members referenced the incident during a public safety hearing held the following week, using it as a case study in why verification procedures mattered regardless of who stood on either side of an arrest. A retired judge who had spent many years on the bench wrote an opinion piece for the local paper arguing that the case illustrated something far larger than one department's failure. A broader pattern in how quickly certainty could replace evidence when pressure and assumption were allowed to move faster than procedure. The story spread through the community with remarkable speed, sparking conversations at dinner tables and community meetings alike about what accountability should actually look like when those meant to enforce the law fail to follow their own procedures. Some residents expressed frustration that it had taken the wrongful arrest of a police captain, someone with the standing and the voice to demand a public investigation, to finally force meaningful change when countless ordinary citizens had endured similar treatment for years without any such reckoning. Others found a measure of hope in watching the system actually respond, watching consequences follow so directly and visibly from a documented failure rather than disappearing into the usual silence that so often followed incidents like this one. Amara herself acknowledged this tension directly and without flinching away from it during a public statement she gave outside the department weeks later. "My rank is the only reason this story is being told at all," she said plainly, her voice carrying clearly across the small crowd of reporters and residents who had gathered to hear her speak. "That should trouble all of us far more than it comforts us," she continued, "because it means this exact same thing happens constantly to people who never get their name checked, who never get their footage pulled, who simply get left in a cell wondering why nobody believed them." Several weeks later, the department called a full staff meeting, gathering nearly every officer from every shift into the largest conference room the building had, the kind of assembly usually reserved only for major policy announcements or moments of department-wide significance. Amara stood at the front of the room, dressed once again in her full captain's uniform, her badge polished and visible on her chest, exactly where it belonged. She spoke without notes, her voice steady, carrying easily to every corner of the silent room. "A badge does not make a person worthy of respect," she told them, letting the words settle before continuing. "It is how we treat the people who are not wearing one that reveals exactly who we really are," she said. And you could have heard a single breath drop in that room. The silence was so complete. She reminded every officer present that the moment she had reached into her bag for that receipt, she had been, in every meaningful sense, exactly like any other citizen standing in that parking lot with no rank, no title, and no built-in protection beyond the same basic rights every person in this country is supposed to be guaranteed. Near the back of the room, Officer Brody Kane rose slowly from his seat, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, and asked if he could speak. Amara nodded, giving him the floor without hesitation. In front of every colleague he worked alongside, Brody offered a public apology, his voice cracking at points as he admitted that he had let his assumptions decide the outcome before the facts ever had the chance to speak for themselves. Amara listened to every word without interrupting him, and when he finished, she thanked him for having the courage to say it aloud, rather than quietly waiting for the moment to be forgotten. "But I don't want your apology directed at me," she told him in the room. "I want it directed at the next person you meet in a parking lot who might not have a badge number that magically appears on a screen to save them," she said, and the weight of that statement seemed to settle over every single person in the room at once. It was not an ending built on forgiveness alone, but an ending built on the harder, more lasting work of actually changing how things would be done from that moment forward. In the months that followed, the department's new procedures were tested in ways nobody could have anticipated, and the true measure of whether anything had genuinely changed would not come from policy documents sitting in a drawer, but from what happened the next time officers responded to a similar call. That test arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at a different store across town when a call came in describing another possible shoplifting suspect matching only a vague physical description, eerily similar in its lack of specificity to the call that had once led 4 officers to surround Amara in a parking lot. This time, however, the responding officers paused before approaching, requesting the store's security footage through their radios before making any assumptions about guilt. This time, when the suspect calmly offered a receipt, an officer actually examined it, checking the timestamp against the store's own records rather than waving it away. This time, a witness who hesitated and said she wasn't entirely certain was gently encouraged to say more rather than being silenced by an impatient manager eager to move things along. The woman in question, a nervous young mother named Denise Lang, who had simply forgotten to remove a price tag from a jacket she had already paid for, was cleared within minutes, standing right there in the parking lot rather than being taken anywhere at all. She left that afternoon, shaken but unharmed, her dignity intact, her afternoon interrupted but not destroyed the way Amara's had been. Amara happened to be nearby that day, driving past on an unrelated errand, and paused her car at the edge of the lot to watch the entire exchange unfold from a distance, careful not to interfere or draw attention to herself. She watched the officers check the footage first. She watched them examine the receipt with genuine attention rather than dismissive suspicion. She watched the young mother drive away moments later, free to continue with whatever was left of her day, never even realizing how differently the same encounter might have unfolded only a few months earlier. Amara allowed herself a small, quiet smile as she pulled back onto the road. Not a smile of vindication for what had happened to her, but something quieter and more meaningful than that. The simple, hard-won satisfaction of watching a broken process finally begin to work the way it always should have. Denise Lang, the young mother who had been so gently and correctly cleared that afternoon, never learned the name of the officers who had treated her with such careful patience, nor did she ever learn that a woman watching quietly from a parked car nearby had once endured the exact opposite treatment in a parking lot not so different from this one. She simply drove home that evening, tucked her daughter into bed, and moved on with her life the way most people do after a frightening moment passes without lasting harm, unaware of the long chain of decisions, apologies, retrainings, and hard conversations that had made her ordinary, uneventful outcome possible at all. That, in its own way, was exactly the kind of quiet victory Amara had been fighting for from the very beginning. Not recognition, not gratitude, but simply the invisible, unremarkable experience of being treated fairly, the kind of experience so many people had once been denied without anyone ever noticing or caring enough to ask why. Reed Sullivan, the young officer whose quiet observations in the back of the patrol car had been among the first cracks in the wrongful assumption everyone else had accepted so easily, found himself thinking about that afternoon often in the years that followed. He eventually requested a transfer into a specialized training division within the department, spending his days teaching new recruits the very lessons he himself had learned firsthand. The importance of noticing details rather than confirming expectations, the discipline required to question a story that seems to explain itself too neatly. He kept a printed still frame from the store's security footage taped inside his locker, not as a trophy or point of pride, but as a quiet, permanent reminder of how easily an entire chain of good intentions could still produce a terrible outcome when nobody paused long enough to ask a single clarifying question. Whenever a new class of recruits passed through his training sessions, Reed told them the story in careful, unflinching detail, always ending with the same simple instruction that the job was never about being right quickly, but about being right however long that took. Amara never spoke publicly again about the details of her own arrest after that staff meeting, choosing instead to let her actions and the department's changed procedures speak for themselves in the months and years that followed. She continued serving as captain, continued mentoring young officers like Reed Sullivan, whose early instincts that day had, in a strange way, been among the first threads that helped unravel the entire mistaken chain of events. She never let the story become about her own vindication, deflecting every opportunity to frame herself as a hero of the moment, insisting instead that the true measure of what happened lay entirely in whether the next ordinary citizen, the next person without a badge number or a captain's rank, would be treated with the same basic fairness she herself had ultimately received only because of who she happened to be. Years later, when younger officers asked her directly why she had chosen to stay silent for so long that afternoon in the parking lot, rather than simply revealing her rank the moment the handcuffs came out, Amara always answered the question the same careful way. She told them that revealing her identity in that moment would have solved her own problem instantly, but it would have left every underlying failure completely untouched, buried beneath the relief of a resolved emergency rather than exposed to the daylight it needed in order to actually change. Silence in that specific moment had been the only way to ensure the system was tested honestly, without any shortcut, without any rank cutting the line before the truth had the chance to matter on its own. It was, she often admitted, one of the hardest decisions of her career, sitting in the back of that patrol car and choosing discomfort over convenience, but she never once described it as a decision she regretted making. That, in the end, was the quiet lesson beneath everything that had unfolded, a lesson that took root far more slowly than the viral footage or the public apologies or the disciplinary hearings ever could. Justice does not begin the moment someone discovers a person's title, their rank, or their position of respect within a community. It begins far earlier than that, in the very first seconds of any encounter, in the willingness to ask a question before assuming an answer, in the discipline to check a receipt before assuming it is false, in the courage to listen to the quiet, uncertain voice at the edge of the crowd instead of silencing it. Real justice begins the moment every person, badge or no badge, is treated as though their word, their evidence, and their dignity matter exactly the same as anyone else's. And it was that lesson, hard-earned in a parking lot on an ordinary afternoon, that Amara Ellison spent the rest of her career trying to make sure no one in her department would ever again have to learn the hard way.